London, 1851. Thomas Harrison sat in a crowded literary salon in Bloomsbury, surrounded by writers, publishers, critics, and admirers. He was the most promising young novelist in London. Everyone wanted him at their gatherings. Every literary journal praised his potential. Every publisher wanted his next manuscript, and Thomas hadn't written anything meaningful in 8 months. Not because he lacked talent, not because he lacked ideas, but because every evening was consumed by exactly this: performing writer for people who celebrated his potential while his actual work slowly died from neglect. That night, walking home through fog-choked streets, Thomas stopped at a bookshop. One volume sat alone in the window. The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. He bought it, read one line, and his entire understanding of his creative death shifted. Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. But genius requires solitude, for true creativity arises from isolation. Thomas realized he'd been so busy being celebrated as a writer that he'd forgotten to actually write. The social recognition had become a substitute for the creative work. And Schopenhauer was about to show him why that substitution was killing everything original inside him. The question isn't whether you should network more as a creative. The question is, what is your social life actually doing to your creative capacity? And why can't you see it destroying you? Chapter 1. The Rise. Thomas's Creative Death, London, 1851. Thomas Harrison was living every writer's dream. 28 years old. His first novel had been modestly successful, praised by critics, discussed in salons, enough to make him a name worth knowing in London's literary circles. Publishers wanted to meet him. Literary societies invited him to speak. Established writers welcomed him into their circles. Every evening brought invitations, dinner with editors, salon discussions about literature, meetings with fellow writers, gatherings where important connections could be made. His mentors told him, "Thomas, your career depends on being visible. Attend everything, meet everyone. The literary world is built on relationships. Your talent will only take you so far. You need to be known, liked, connected." And Thomas believed them. He attended everything. He was charming at dinners, insightful at salons, agreeable in literary discussions. Everyone said he had a bright future. But something was wrong. Every morning, Thomas sat at his desk to write his second novel, the one that would prove his first wasn't a fluke, the one that would establish him as a serious artist. And nothing came, not writer's block in the traditional sense. He had ideas, but they felt shallow, derivative, exactly like the conversations he'd been having at salons, clever on the surface, empty underneath. He'd write a page, read it back, recognize it as a slightly modified version of something he'd discussed at dinner the previous evening. Someone else's insight, filtered through his pen, claimed as his own because the boundaries had become so blurred. His mornings were spent recovering from evenings, his afternoons preparing for evenings, his evenings performing writer while actual writing became impossible. 8 months passed. His publishers were patient but starting to inquire. His literary reputation was still warm but cooling. His potential was still discussed, but with increasing skepticism. One evening, after a particularly exhausting salon, 3 hours of discussing the nature of creativity without a single original thought emerging, Thomas sat in his study and confronted a terrifying truth. He was becoming exactly what he appeared to be, a literary socialite who talked about writing instead of someone who actually wrote. His desk drawer held 47 false starts, abandoned chapters, ideas that collapsed under their own hollowness, 8 months of work that produced nothing worth finishing. That week, walking through Bloomsbury, Thomas passed a bookshop. In the window, The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. Thomas knew the name. The pessimistic hermit. Fellow writers mocked him at parties. The philosopher who hates humanity. The misanthrope who chooses isolation over life. But something made Thomas buy it. That night he read, "True creativity arises from solitude. It is in isolation that the mind can transcend the will and give birth to art. From solitude, not from collaboration, not from community, not from networking or literary circles or salon discussions. Solitude." Thomas continued, "The more unintelligent a man is, the less mysterious existence seems to him." He understood immediately. His salon conversations were making him stupider. Not intellectually, his opinions were clever enough, but creatively. Every discussion pulled him toward consensus, toward shared understanding, toward ideas that everyone could grasp immediately. Nothing mysterious, nothing deep, nothing that required genuine solitude to explore. The next evening, Thomas declined a dinner invitation. First time in months. His friend was shocked. "Thomas, the editor of Fraser's magazine, will be there. This could be important for your career." "I need to write." "You can write any time. These opportunities are rare." But Thomas was discovering he couldn't write any time. He could only write when his mind was actually his own, and it was never his own anymore. That evening alone, Thomas sat at his desk. The silence felt strange, uncomfortable. His mind kept reaching for the stimulation of conversation, the validation of others' reactions. But he forced himself to sit, to think, to let ideas develop without immediately testing them against what others would think. And something happened. A genuine idea emerged. Not clever, not immediately impressive, but original. Something that would require months of solitary exploration to fully develop. The kind of idea that dies in conversation, that gets workshopped into mediocrity, that requires protection from the well-meaning feedback of others. Thomas picked up Schopenhauer again. Solitude is the soil in which genius thrives. He was beginning to understand what the philosopher meant. Chapter 2. The principle. Creative work requires creative isolation. Thomas became obsessed with understanding what was happening to his creative capacity, and Schopenhauer provided the framework, the core. Principle, social interaction, and creative production are neurologically incompatible, not just difficult to balance. Incompatible. Schopenhauer wrote, "Genius requires solitude. The creative mind cannot flourish in the noise of society. It needs silence to hear its own voice, space to follow its own vision." Thomas tested this ruthlessly. He documented every day, days with social obligations, no meaningful writing, days in solitude. Ideas flowed, work progressed. The correlation was perfect and terrifying. But why? Schopenhauer explained, "What the herd hates most is the one who thinks differently. It is not so much the opinion itself, but the audacity of wanting to think for themselves. Social interaction pulls you toward consensus, toward shared understanding, toward ideas that the group can immediately validate. But original creative work, by definition, exists outside consensus. It's the idea no one else sees, the vision no one else shares, the target no one else can hit." Thomas started observing his literary circle with brutal honesty. At a salon discussing poetry, one writer shared a genuinely unusual interpretation of Keats. The room went silent, uncomfortable. Someone changed the subject. Later, people whispered, "That was strange." Message received. Original thinking creates social friction, so everyone learned to share variations of accepted opinions, clever rearrangements of familiar ideas. Nothing truly new. The salon celebrated itself as a place for creative minds to connect, but it was actually a mechanism for enforcing creative conformity. Thomas discovered a devastating passage in Schopenhauer. The wise creator recognizes that protecting an idea from premature exposure is an act of care, not fear. Premature exposure. That's what he'd been doing, sharing ideas before they were fully formed, testing every creative impulse against others' reactions, letting their feedback shape his vision before he'd even discovered what his vision was. At a dinner party, Thomas mentioned a novel idea he was considering, a psychological exploration of guilt without conventional moral framework. The table's reaction was immediate. "That's dark, Thomas. Readers want hope, not despair. You should add a redemptive arc. Have you considered making it more accessible?" 10 minutes of helpful feedback that killed the idea completely. Not because the feedback was wrong, it was perfectly reasonable, but because it pulled the idea toward what everyone could imagine, away from what only Thomas could see. Schopenhauer's words echoed, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see." If everyone can see it, it's not genius. It's just competent execution of familiar ideas. Thomas wrote in his journal, "I finally understand why Schopenhauer is right. Social interaction doesn't enhance creativity. It normalizes it. It pulls every original impulse toward the mean. The group can only validate what the group already understands. If I want to create something genuinely original, I must create it in solitude. Not because I'm antisocial, because originality by definition cannot be socially validated until after it exists." The principle was clear. Creative work requires creative isolation. Social validation during creation guarantees mediocrity. This wasn't about balance. You couldn't half socialize and half create. The mental states were mutually exclusive. Thomas had to choose: be celebrated as a writer, or actually do the writing that matters. Chapter 3. The Test, the Publisher's Ultimatum. Spring 1852. Thomas began withdrawing from London's literary scene. Not dramatically, just declining more invitations than he accepted, creating space, time alone, time to write without the constant interference of others' opinions. His literary circle noticed immediately. Thomas is becoming difficult. He's too serious now. Success has made him arrogant. The interpretation was predictable. Choosing solitude means something is wrong with you. One evening, 3 fellow writers confronted him at his flat. "Thomas, everyone is concerned. You're withdrawing from the community. You're missing important events. This isn't how literary careers are built." Thomas looked at these men, all talented, all producing competent work, none creating anything that would outlive them. "Tell me honestly, when was the last time any of you wrote something that genuinely surprised you? Not work that met expectations, but work that exceeded what you thought you were capable of." Silence. Then defensive answers about professional obligations and market realities. Thomas continued, "I'm withdrawing because every hour I spend at a salon is an hour I'm not writing. And I'm starting to realize the social validation I get from performing writer has become a substitute for actually creating work that matters. That's selfish, Thomas. Art isn't created in isolation. It's created in community, in dialogue with, name one masterpiece created by committee." 1. More silence. Dostoyevsky wrote Crime and Punishment in isolation. Flaubert spent years alone perfecting Madame Bovary. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in exile. Every work that changed literature was created by someone willing to be alone with an idea long enough for it to become something no one else could imagine. His friends left, frustrated. Thomas felt something shift, not regret, but clarity. The next week brought the real test. His publisher, Mr. Blackwood, requested a meeting. The second novel was overdue. The market was waiting. His reputation wouldn't stay warm forever. "Mr. Harrison, we need to discuss your progress, or rather, your lack of progress." Thomas was honest. "I've spent 8 months attending every literary event in London. I've been networking, being visible, building relationships, exactly what everyone said I should do, and I've produced nothing worth publishing. So what's your plan? I need 6 months of solitude. No salons, no dinners, no literary society, just writing. Blackwood frowned. Thomas, 6 months of isolation is professional suicide. You'll be forgotten. The literary world moves fast. Visibility matters. Does it? Or does work matter? Show me a writer remembered for attending parties versus one remembered for producing great work. You're being naive. Literary success requires what it required in 1820, or what it actually requires. Schopenhauer wrote his masterpiece in complete isolation. It sold poorly for decades. Now, studied worldwide. Meanwhile, every successful writer from his time, the ones who networked, attended everything, stayed visible, completely forgotten. Blackwood stood. 6 months. But if you produce nothing, we're done. The ultimatum was clear. Thomas had chosen solitude over visibility, work over reputation, creation over performance. That evening he wrote in his journal, Schopenhauer was right. Society doesn't want your best work. It wants your compliance. The moment you choose the work over the world, they call you difficult, arrogant, naive. But I am discovering their judgment is based on their inability to create anything that transcends their own understanding. They celebrate mediocrity because excellence threatens them. He'd passed the test. He'd chosen himself and the work. Chapter 4. Warrior. Psychology. How socializing murders creativity. Thomas spent the next week studying exactly how social obligations destroyed creative capacity. Combining Schopenhauer's philosophy with his own brutal honesty revealed multiple mechanisms. Layer 1. Attention residue. Every social interaction leaves attention residue, mental fragments that persist for hours afterward. Thomas documented this. After attending a dinner party, he'd return home intending to write, but his mind was full of things he said that might have been misunderstood. Opinions others expressed that required mental processing, social dynamics he was still analyzing, anxiety about how he was perceived. Modern psychology would later call this attention residue. Schopenhauer called it the mental pollution of society. For 3-4 hours after any social event, creative work was impossible. The mental state required for deep creative thought simply wasn't available. Multiply this. 3 events per week, 9 to 12 hours of attention residue. Every week, 468, 624 hours per year, completely unavailable for creative work. Layer 2. The validation trap. Social gatherings provided immediate validation. People laughed at his wit, praised his insights, celebrated his presence. Schopenhauer wrote, "The mind can become addicted to the immediate rewards of social approval, making it unable to tolerate the delayed rewards of creative work." Creative work offers no immediate validation. You write for months, uncertain if it's any good. You develop ideas in isolation with no way to know if they'll resonate. Social validation becomes a drug. Why spend 6 months alone on uncertain work when you can get immediate validation by being clever at dinner? Thomas recognized he'd been substituting social validation for creative fulfillment, and social validation is far more addictive because it's immediate. Layer 3. The dilution effect. Every time Thomas shared an idea socially, it got diluted. Not through malice, through the natural process of making ideas accessible. His dinner companions would offer helpful suggestions. That's interesting, but have you considered? Readers might not understand that. You could make it more relatable if. Each suggestion pulled the idea toward what they could imagine, away from what only Thomas could see. Schopenhauer. The genuinely reflective mind challenges the rules everyone takes for granted. But social feedback enforces those rules. makes ideas more conventional, more safe, more like everything else. Layer 4. Creative energy as finite resource. Thomas discovered creative energy is finite. Social performance consumes it. Being on at a literary salon, witty, insightful, engaging, required enormous mental energy. The same energy needed for creative work. By evening's end, he'd be creatively depleted. Nothing left for actual writing. Schopenhauer. Lost time is gone forever. But it wasn't just time. It was the specific mental energy required for creative production, once spent socially, unavailable for months. Layer 5. The depth requirement. Great creative work requires sustained depth. Hours of uninterrupted focus on a single complex idea. Modern neuroscience shows it takes 23 minutes to fully engage in deep work after any interruption. Thomas calculated if he attended events 3 evenings per week, he lost. 3 evenings completely, no work possible. 3 mornings recovering, still mentally fragmented. 6 periods of 23+ minutes, reaching depth after interruption, effective creative capacity, reduced by 60 to 70% from social obligations alone. Schopenhauer understood this intuitively. Solitude is the soil in which genius thrives. Not metaphorical, literal. The brain cannot produce original creative work without extended periods of uninterrupted solitude. Layer 6. Vision corruption. Most insidious, social interaction slowly corrupts your creative vision. Thomas noticed, after discussing his novel's direction at a salon, his writing shifted toward what he'd described. Not what he'd originally envisioned, what he'd made palatable for others. His authentic vision, strange, uncomfortable, possibly uncommercial, got replaced by a socially acceptable version. Described so many times it became the plan. Schopenhauer. In the end, the mind thrives, not when it bends to the expectations of others, but when it claims the quiet of its own space. Thomas wrote in his journal, "Social interaction doesn't just steal time from creative work. It corrupts the work itself. Every conversation about my novel changes what I'm willing to write. Every feedback session normalizes my vision. Every discussion pulls me toward writing something everyone can imagine, rather than something only I can see." Schopenhauer is absolutely right. Genius requires solitude not just for time, but for protection. Protection of the strange, uncomfortable vision that dies in the light of social acceptability. One evening, reading Schopenhauer by candlelight, Thomas felt the philosopher speaking directly to him across decades. "I have discovered what you are now discovering, that creative work cannot survive in social air. That originality requires isolation, that every hour spent performing artist for others is an hour stolen from actually creating art." Thomas continued reading, and Schopenhauer's words seemed to reach through time. If you feel what I describe, if your social calendar has replaced your creative calendar, if validation from others has become more appealing than work itself, if you've been discussing your art more than making it, know that you're not failing. You're simply trying to create under conditions that make creation impossible. He closed the book, feeling understood for the first time in months, not by his literary circle, but by a dead German philosopher who'd chosen the same path. If you feel this, if you recognize yourself in Thomas's struggle, in Schopenhauer's analysis, then join us at The Gentleman Philosopher. We're building a community of creators who understand that great work requires the courage to disappoint those who want your presence more than your art. Subscribe to continue this exploration, because the deepest creative work happens not in community, but in solitude. Chapter 5. The Transformation, 6 Months of Solitude. Autumn 1852. Thomas disappeared from London's literary scene completely. No salons, no dinners, no meetings with fellow writers, no performances of promising young novelist. He created what Schopenhauer called a life organized around creative necessity rather than social obligation. Morning, wake at 5 a.m., 3 hours of writing before the world makes demands. Mind fresh, uncontaminated by others' opinions. Afternoon, walk alone through London, not Hyde Park where he'd meet acquaintances, but forgotten neighborhoods where no one knew him. Think, process, let ideas develop. Evening, read. Not contemporary literature that would influence his voice, but philosophy, history, anything distant enough to inspire without imitating. Night, more writing, or sitting in silence with developing ideas, learning to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing if his work was any good. No external validation, no immediate feedback, just the work and his willingness to trust it. His literary friends thought him mad. His publisher worried. His reputation cooled from rising star to whatever happened to Thomas Harrison. But something extraordinary happened. Thomas's novel began emerging. Not the socially acceptable version he described at salons. Something stranger, darker, more psychologically complex than anything he'd attempted. Characters that made no sense socially. They would be called unlikable in any workshop. But they were psychologically true in a way his previously likable characters never were. Plot that violated conventional structure. It would be called meandering by any editor. But it followed emotional logic, not market logic. Themes that would make dinner guests uncomfortable. They would change the subject if he mentioned them. But they were the actual questions haunting him, explored without accommodation. One evening, 3 months into isolation, Thomas read what he'd written and didn't recognize his own work. Not because it was bad, because it was actually his. For the first time, truly his. Not influenced by what others expected. Not modified by workshop feedback. Not softened by the need for social approval. Just the strange, uncomfortable, psychologically complex vision that could only emerge in complete isolation. He thought of Schopenhauer's words. True creativity arises from solitude. It is in isolation that the mind can transcend the will and give birth to art. Thomas had spent years trying to transcend through social recognition, but transcendence only came when he stopped seeking it from others. By month 5, Thomas had something no one expected, a completed novel. Not the commercial success his publisher hoped for, not the accessible work his friends encouraged, but something genuinely original. He read it through and felt terrified, not because it was bad, because it was too honest, too strange, too much of what he actually thought rather than what would be acceptable to say. Schopenhauer. The wise creator recognizes that protecting an idea from premature exposure is an act of care. Thomas had protected this work from premature exposure, from helpful feedback, from social dilution, and now it existed, imperfect, uncomfortable, but authentically his. The transformation was complete, not from unpublished to published, from performing writer to actually writing. But London's literary world doesn't forgive those who choose work over social performance. And what happened next would test whether Thomas's isolation had produced genius or madness. Chapter 6. Deep Training Arc. The Practices of Creative Solitude. Thomas didn't just embrace solitude, he systematized it. Following Schopenhauer's philosophy, he developed specific practices for protecting creative capacity. Practice 1. The Sacred Morning. 3 hours every morning, completely unavailable. No correspondence, no meetings, no exceptions. Schopenhauer. The best part of a man's life is the time he spends alone. Thomas made this literal. 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. belonged to the work. Nothing else existed. In these hours, his mind was fresh, uncontaminated by others' ideas, capable of the sustained depth genuine creative work requires. After 2 months, Thomas noticed These 3 hours produced more real work than his previous 40-hour weeks of being a writer. Practice 2. The feedback quarantine. No discussing work in progress, ever. Thomas learned every time he described his novel to someone, it changed. Not consciously, but their reaction influenced what he wrote next. If they seemed confused, he'd simplify. If they seemed skeptical, he'd justify. If they seemed bored, he'd add excitement. None of this improved the work. It just made it more conventional. Schopenhauer. Protecting an idea from premature exposure is an act of care. Thomas created absolute quarantine. The work stayed private until complete. No exceptions. Practice. 3. The attention budget. Thomas recognized attention is the creator's only real resource. He created strict boundaries, 0 literary salons, consumed 4+ hours of attention each. 0 quick meetings, 23+ minutes to return to depth afterward. Maximum 1 social obligation per week. Mandatory recovery day after. Before, 15 to 20 hours per week socially obligated, 15-20 hours creatively unavailable. After, 2-3 hours per week socially obligated, 60+ hours creatively available. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Practice 4. The vision protection. Thomas kept a vision journal. The uncomfortable, uncommercial, socially unacceptable ideas at the core of his work. Every time he felt tempted to make his novel more accessible, he'd read this journal. Remember what he was actually trying to create. Schopenhauer. What the herd hates most is the one who thinks differently. The herd would hate parts of his novel. That was how Thomas knew he was onto something original. If everyone immediately understood and approved, he'd know he'd failed to create anything genuinely new. Practice 5. The solitude walk. 2 hours daily, no destination, no companion, no distraction, just walking, thinking, letting ideas develop without interruption. Schopenhauer had walked Frankfurt streets daily. Dostoyevsky walked St. Petersburg. Dickens walked London at night. Thomas discovered ideas that seemed impossibly tangled while sitting became clear while walking, but only alone. Companionship destroyed the internal dialogue where creative solutions emerged. Practice 6. The completion commitment. Thomas made one rule: finish the work before seeking any validation. Not feedback at chapter 3, not showing drafts to trusted friends, not testing ideas at salons. Complete the vision, then expose it to the world. Schopenhauer. The genuinely reflective mind challenges rules everyone takes for granted. Thomas couldn't challenge those rules while constantly seeking permission from those who upheld them. By month 6, Thomas's practices were automatic, not discipline, just how he lived. People who observed from outside saw isolation and obsession. Thomas experienced focus and creative fulfillment he'd never known was possible. Schopenhauer's philosophy had given him permission. His practices had given him structure. His solitude had given him his actual work. And that work was about to face its ultimate test. Late one winter evening, Thomas wrote in his journal with unusual clarity. He felt he was writing not just for himself, but for any creator who would face the same choice. For 6 months, I have practiced what Schopenhauer taught, that creative work cannot coexist with social performance, that originality requires isolation, that every hour spent being celebrated as a writer is an hour not spent actually writing. He paused, feeling the weight of what he'd discovered. If you're reading this, if you've been networking more than creating, discussing more than doing, seeking validation more than seeking truth, know that you're not lazy. You're simply trying to create under conditions where creation is impossible. Join us in this practice, not by abandoning everyone, but by understanding that your work requires protection from well-meaning feedback, from helpful suggestions, from the social dilution that makes everything accessible and nothing original. Subscribe to this philosophy. Better alone and creating than surrounded and discussing. Walk this path with those who understand that great work requires disappointing those who want your presence more than your art. Thomas closed his journal, knowing his words would find those ready to hear them. Then he returned to his work, the strange, uncomfortable novel that could only exist because he'd had the courage to create it alone. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation. Publication and Rejection. Spring 1853. Thomas delivered his completed manuscript to Mr. Blackwood. The publisher read it over 3 days, then summoned Thomas to his office. "Mr. Harrison, I don't know what to say. This is not what we expected." "Is it good?" "It's disturbing. The protagonist is unlikable. The structure is unconventional. The themes are dark. Critics won't know what to make of it. Readers will find it challenging." "That wasn't my question. Is it good?" Blackwood paused. "It's the most original thing I've read in 20 years, but original doesn't mean successful. I can publish this, but I cannot promise it will succeed." "Publish it." The novel released quietly in autumn 1853. The critical response was immediate and brutal. "Mr. Harrison has produced a work of baffling strangeness. Readers seeking entertainment will be disappointed." The author seems to have forgotten the fundamentals of storytelling. His literary circle was more direct. At a chance encounter, a former friend, "Thomas, what were you thinking? This novel is, I'm sorry, but it's difficult, inaccessible. You've isolated yourself for 6 months to produce this." Thomas felt something unexpected, not regret, but certainty. "Yes, I isolated myself from your helpful feedback, your accessible suggestions, your conventional wisdom. And I produced exactly what I intended, something you cannot immediately understand, something that requires what you're unwilling to give, sustained attention." Sales were poor. Reviews were mixed. His publisher expressed disappointment. But Thomas received 3 letters that changed everything. One from a young writer. "Your novel is the first I've read that captures what thinking actually feels like." One from a philosophy professor. "You've done in fiction what Schopenhauer does in philosophy, shown truth regardless of whether it's comfortable." One from a reader. "I've read it twice. I don't fully understand it, but it's haunted me for weeks. That's never happened before." Thomas understood. He'd created something that required active engagement, that couldn't be passively consumed, that rewarded sustained attention. Exactly what Schopenhauer said genuine creative work required. 10 years later, Thomas's novel would be recognized as ahead of its time. 20 years later, studied in universities. 50 years later, called a masterpiece. But in 1853, it was just a strange book by a writer who'd chosen isolation over popularity. And Thomas was completely at peace with that, because he'd finally understood what Schopenhauer taught. You can be celebrated for creating accessible work, or you can create work worth celebrating. Rarely both simultaneously. He'd chosen the latter, and paid the immediate price for the long-term reward. Final reveal. The philosophical truth. Years later, in 1865, Thomas sat in his study reflecting on a decade of creative solitude. His second, third, and fourth novels had followed the same pattern. Created in isolation, initially misunderstood, eventually recognized. And he discovered what Schopenhauer spent his life teaching. The uncomfortable truth modern culture hides. Social performance and creative production are neurologically incompatible, not difficult to balance, impossible to combine. Every hour spent performing creative person for others is an hour not creating. Every discussion about your work dilutes the vision. Every feedback session normalizes the idea. Schopenhauer wrote, "Solitude is the soil in which genius thrives." Not metaphor, biology. The brain state required for deep creative work. Extended focus, comfortable with ambiguity, following ideas wherever they lead, is incompatible with the brain state required for social performance, monitoring reactions, seeking approval, making ideas accessible. You literally cannot do both. History proves the pattern. Proust wrote in a cork-lined room, isolated from society. Kafka created at night. Away from everyone, Dickinson wrote in near total isolation. Dostoyevsky produced his masterpieces in solitude. Newton did his greatest work during plague, isolation. Were they lonely? Or were they protecting the exact conditions genius requires? Thomas understood. The creators remembered for changing their fields were those willing to be forgotten by their contemporaries, who chose the work over the world. Meanwhile, every successful creator from their time, the ones who networked, stayed visible, accommodated market demands, completely forgotten. Schopenhauer's words echoed, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. But genius requires solitude." Thomas had learned this truth through painful experience. You cannot create something genuinely original while constantly seeking permission from those who can only imagine the familiar. The choice is stark. Socialize constantly and produce competent work that fits expectations, or isolate deliberately and create work that transcends what anyone expected was possible. Not both. Never both. The social world will call you difficult, arrogant, wasting your talent. But Schopenhauer knew better. You're not wasting your talent, you're finally using it. Ending. The Philosopher's Lesson. London, 1870. A young writer, struggling, exhausted, attending every literary event, stopped at the bookshop Thomas had discovered 20 years earlier. In the window, The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. The young writer bought it. Read the first page. Everything changed. That evening she found Thomas at his home. Everyone knew the reclusive novelist who'd chosen isolation. "Mr. Harrison, I just read Schopenhauer, and I recognize myself in what he describes. I'm so busy being writer that I never write. I attend every salon, every dinner, every event, and I've produced nothing worth reading." Thomas looked at this young woman, late 20s, exactly his age when he'd made the same discovery. "Then you understand what Schopenhauer taught me. The tragedy isn't creating in isolation. It's performing creativity for others while your actual work dies from neglect." "But what do I do? If I withdraw, I'll lose all my connections." Thomas smiled. "You'll lose connections who only valued you as audience for their opinions, and you'll gain something far more valuable. The conditions under which genuine creative work becomes possible." But isn't that selfish? Shouldn't art be created in community? Name one masterpiece created by committee, one work that changed literature produced through collaboration and constant feedback. Silence. Art is created in community after it's created. During creation, it requires protection from helpful feedback, from accessible suggestions, from the social dilution that makes everything normal and nothing original. The young woman left with determination in her eyes. Thomas watched her go. Understanding the cycle continued. Schopenhauer's wisdom passed through those brave enough to choose the work over the world. True creators don't network their way to masterpieces. They isolate their way to them. Choose carefully. Because as Schopenhauer knew and Thomas proved, you can be celebrated for creating, or you can create something worth celebrating. Rarely both. Never simultaneously. Stand alone. Protect your vision. Create what only you can see. The discipline of creative solitude that Schopenhauer taught and Thomas practiced, it continues today. Not in Victorian London, but in every creator who feels their social calendar consuming the time and energy needed for actual creation. If this exploration of creativity, solitude, and artistic integrity resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to The Gentleman Philosopher. Your subscription helps us create more content like this. deep philosophical investigations into what great work actually requires and why modern culture's advice about networking and community often destroys the very creativity it claims to support. We're building a community of creators who understand that great work requires protecting your vision from premature exposure, your time from social obligations, and your mind from the constant dilution of others' opinions, who choose depth over accessibility, originality over approval, creation over performance. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking deeply about what your creative work actually needs. Thank you for considering that maybe, just maybe, your exhausting social calendar isn't supporting your creativity, but systematically destroying it. Until next time, protect your creative solitude. Guard your attention like the finite resource it is. Be ruthlessly selective about who gets access to your work in progress. The world needs more creators and fewer performers. Be the former, choose carefully. Because as Schopenhauer taught, talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. But genius requires solitude. Stand alone. Create what only you can see. Become what only solitude allows.